And with us we have Raffi Elliott, Political Risk Analyst from Yerevan, Armenia. Hello, sir. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show.
So we know that Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan agreed to hand over 4 villages to Azerbaijan. We also know that foreign ministers of Azerbaijan and Armenia held a 2-day meeting in Kazakhstan. Tell us about the current situation in Armenia. Tell us about the citizens, about the protests.
Sure. I will try to briefly provide a bit of context. So as you guys have already mentioned on your show, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Armenia and Azerbaijan were already essentially engaged in what was a civil war within the Soviet Union, and then eventually an ethnic conflict and an interstate conflict broke out when the Soviet Union collapsed. And thus, unlike with Armenia's borders with Iran or Georgia, for instance, the border with Azerbaijan was never officially demarcated because it wasn't so much a border as it was a line of contact. So it was a militarized line. And so in many areas, because of the way the Soviets had drawn the borders between the Soviet republics of Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and so on, these were never intended to be interstate borders. And so they were essentially just lines drawn on a map. And when the conflict broke out, the trench lines were essentially set to meet the topography where it was more easily defended and not exactly following the Soviet-era boundaries. As a result, there were several square kilometers on either side that have been of Azerbaijani territory or legal Azerbaijani territory that were behind the Armenian trench lines, and several kilometers of Armenian territory behind the Azeri lines. So when we're talking about these 3 or 4 villages, we're actually talking about 3 or 4 essentially abandoned villages that were abandoned in 1992 during the localized fighting there, and a readjustment of the border. I think that we're talking something like 8 square kilometers altogether. So Armenia isn't actually giving up sovereign territory of the Republic of Armenia. They are giving elements of a no man's land that had never been properly defined as part of an ongoing process of border demarcation, which has actually originally began right after the ceasefire of November 9th, 2020, which defined Armenia's southern border all the way to the Iranian frontier. And then this is essentially the continuation of which. The understanding, though, is that Azerbaijan had demanded the return of these 3.5 or 4 abandoned villages during a meeting in Germany between the Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan and the Azeri President Ilham Aliyev. And Armenia reiterated by turning that process of demand into a arbitrated demarcation system. And they're essentially slowly going through the entire border.
Right.
So that's essentially what's provoking the issue.
Provoking the issue indeed. And I'm just curious now, because I think through what we can see on the screen there, we have protests, I believe, in the capital of Yerevan, quite large protests, I'd say. I'm just wondering, I mean, there's calls for the resignation of Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. So what does this mean for his government? How stable is this? How will this impact? Will this be used potentially by other political forces? How much of a, let's say, threat is this to the stability of the Armenian government?
So it is being used by other political forces. In fact, the man standing behind the priest in the footage you just showed you is a MP for one of the opposition parties. But essentially, every summer since the end of the 2020 war, there's been protests, often organized or led or incited by the opposition. And in Armenia, the opposition fluctuates, but it essentially encompasses a number of groups that had formed the government before the 2018 Velvet Revolution, which brought Nikol Pashinyan into power. Many of these people, of course, are looking for vindication, are looking to try to prove that Pashinyan's policies may have led to the war and been disastrous for Armenia, and therefore it's an attempt for them to regain power. However, in this case, these protests were triggered by an archbishop, Bagrat Galistanian, who is the Archbishop of the Tavush region. The Tavush region is the one bordering Azerbaijan where this current demarcation is going on. He's the man in white in this footage right now. And he initially tried to block the border demarcators from doing their work up in these regions. And then he then organized a march onto Yerevan last Friday, in which several opposition parties mobilized their supporters to meet him on the square in Yerevan, and that's the footage you're seeing right now. This is from Friday. Now, the protest on Friday was actually quite large. Some estimates say 30 to 40,000 people, which is probably the largest opposition protest that has taken place since the 2020 war and the 2021 post-war parliamentary election. However, since then, it seems to have dissipated somewhat, with the numbers on the next day being about half that, and then the numbers 2 days later being a little bit less than that. And that's likely because it's unclear whether the opposition and the bishop's message has been convincing to Armenian voters. Of course, to be clear, the issue of demarcation is anxiety-provoking in the Armenian public throughout society, whether people are supporters of the prime minister or his opponents. And many people probably did come on Friday to hear what the bishop had to say, though many may perhaps have been unconvinced or even disappointed that the bishop essentially, who had promised that his only demand was to stop the demarcation process, which, by the way, at this time in this region is roughly 90% complete anyway. And then he instead demanded the prime minister's resignation. And then the next day, he also told a reporter from Radio Free Europe that if God wanted it, he would potentially present himself as a candidate for prime minister. So now the archbishop apparently has political ambitions. So that in itself may have driven a wedge amongst his potential supporters. With that said, the government does not seem to be worried. It has said it's not worried. However, some have also pointed out that the government has been spreading rumors, trying to connect this archbishop with the former opposition and make him a direct link to Russian and FSB interests in Armenia.
Okay,
which
well,
some have interpreted as a scare tactic.
Well, that's very, very interesting. Well, thank you for giving Armenia's side of the story.